been focusing on China this programmatic season because of the important role on the world stage and in US economic and foreign policy. It's no secret that China is in the midst of dynamic change, and many believe that they are now our equal in soft and hard power. Luckily, our speaker tonight, Dr. Elizabeth Economy, is one of the nation's foremost experts on Chinese domestic and foreign policy and can help us understand just what this means for American influence abroad. Good evening and welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us. I'm Liz Brailsford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Moderating our event is Steve Gardner, Professor and Director of the McBride Center for International Business at Baylor University. And Steve, I have to say congratulations to Baylor's basketball team for their win in March Madness. I am very sorry to say that I did not have them at the top, so my bracket did not do as well, but congratulations, and what a tournament that was. Steve will be in discussion with Dr. Elizabeth Economy, Senior Fellow for China Studies at CFR, and also a Senior Fellow at Stanford University on the subject of her latest book, The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State. You can purchase your copy of The Third Revolution at Interrobang Books, our local bookstore partner. Our audience receives a 10% discount from the Interrobang Books online store by using the code dfwworld. And remember, that discount code is good for not just The Third Revolution, but any of the books in your shopping cart. Dr. Economy also has a new book that will be released in November later this year, so keep an eye out for that later. And tonight is the last program of our 7-event series with Baylor University. I want to thank Baylor again, and Steve in particular, who I visited with last month, just a few weeks ago. I can't believe how long ago that seems already, but just a few weeks ago at the university. It was a pleasure to visit. And I just want to thank him in particular for his wonderful support of our council and this series and allowing us to partner on this with you. We are grateful and we look forward to doing it again with you soon. I'd like to remind everyone that you too can sponsor a program and get in touch with our Alana Buenrostro if you are interested at 956-466-1149 about sponsorship opportunities. And now, Steve, the floor is yours. Thanks to both of you again.
Well, thank you so much, Liz Brailsford. We have two Liz's here tonight. So thank you, Liz Brailsford. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with you and Rachel Vogel and Kirsten Kullenberg and others at the council and at Baylor to produce this series. Again, welcome to Dallas, Liz, and your new role as president of the council. I've already enjoyed getting to know you and look forward to working with you in the future. We've already made some really exciting plans and looking forward to all of that. And now, special thanks to Liz Economy for joining us today to discuss the changing role of China in the world. Elizabeth Economy is a Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Dr. Economy received her BA with honors from Swarthmore College, where she now serves on the governing board, and her master's from Stanford University, where, again, she currently serves as a Senior Research Fellow. And she earned her Ph.D. from the University of Michigan. And right now, I'll just mention that her dissertation title back in 1994 was Negotiating the Terrain of Global Climate Change Policy in the Soviet Union and China, Linking International and Domestic Decision-Making Pathways. So back in 1994, when some people in this country were still questioning the reality of climate change, Dr. Economy was already exploring the international implications of that issue. As Liz Brailsford just mentioned, her most recent book, The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State, was published a couple of years ago by the Oxford University Press and has really become required reading for anyone who hopes to understand the current Chinese landscape. She's the author or editor of 4 other books and numerous publications in the academic literature and popular press. Her next book, The World According to China, will appear in November, and I'm already looking forward to that one. I also recommend for your attention Dr. Economy's testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee only a few weeks ago, that includes a comprehensive set of policy recommendations that I think should be quite helpful to the Biden administration. So welcome, Liz, to this joint project of Baylor University and the World Affairs Council of DFW. In your book, The Third Revolution, and your recent Senate testimony, you begin by laying out the changes that have occurred in China since President Xi came to power in 2012, defining the challenge that we now face in the Western world. Then you conclude with policy recommendations for the U.S. I'd like to go through a similar process. So let's start at the beginning. You talk about the third revolution. What are these 3 revolutions that China has experienced, and how do they differ from one another?
Sure. And thanks, Steve. It's really great to be here with you and with Liz, of the World Affairs Council and Baylor. I have to say, you are the only person I can remember in I don't know how many years who has introduced me with my dissertation from 1994. And there's so much wrong with that, I have to say. First of all, there was the Soviet Union. Second, it was 1994, which clearly dates me. And third, the title's like 800 words long. So in any case, but
That's a dissertation.
We're going to focus on Xi Jinping and China tonight. So, you know, the idea that how I thought about the third revolution, or the 3 revolutions, really came to me from a speech that Xi Jinping gave at the 19th Party Congress in 2017, when he said, you know, China has stood up, grown rich, become strong, and now is moving towards center stage. And it occurred to me that that kind of defined sort of the 3 periods of Chinese contemporary history. So China stood up is the first revolution, and that's the revolution that Mao Zedong led, that, you know, created the contemporary Chinese Communist Party state, the People's Republic of China as we know it today in 1949. Excuse me, if you fast forward, you know, roughly 30 years to 1978, 1979, you have the second revolution, and that's Deng Xiaoping. And that's the period of China getting rich. And it's a period where, you know, Deng Xiaoping, you know, welcomed the international community into China. He opened China. He moved away from Mao Zedong's one-man authoritarian leadership to a much more collective leadership. You know, he introduced the market into China, not only the market in terms of the economy, but really the marketplace of ideas. And he welcomed, you know, insight and opinion and foreign capital from the outside world. And he also said, you know, that China should maintain a low-profile foreign policy. So, you know, a fairly radically different picture of China began to emerge in that second revolution led by Deng Xiaoping. Fast forward just a little bit more than 30 years to 2012, and you have the advent of Xi Jinping. And that's the third revolution, and that's the period in which China becomes strong, and as he says, is moving towards center stage. And that was, you know, 2017, and I would say by now, you know, roughly 4 years later, China is at the center stage. And Xi Jinping really has transformed China, I would argue. You know, he moved away from Deng Xiaoping's collective leadership back to a much more one-man authoritarian form of leadership, centralizing a lot of power into his own hands. He, you know, reasserted the power of the Chinese Communist Party into Chinese society, into the Chinese economy. You know, that was something that, you know, Deng had reversed from the Maoist era. He had really tried to remove the party in many respects from everyday political and economic life in China. Xi Jinping also created what I call, you know, a virtual wall of restrictions and regulations so that he could more closely control what comes into the country and what goes out of the country, right? So he doesn't really want a lot of foreign ideas, foreign culture coming into China. You know, passed a very restrictive foreign non-governmental organization law, for example, that ended up, cutting the number of foreign NGOs in China that were operating on issues like the environment or poverty alleviation or health from over 7,000 in 2016 to around 500 after 2017. So again, very different. And of course, I think the most noticeable difference for, most of us here in the United States is that Xi Jinping clearly doesn't believe in a low-profile foreign policy. He has a much more ambitious and assertive Chinese foreign policy that I think is, really about transforming the international landscape so that it reflects Chinese values and norms and policy preferences. So those are the three revolutions as sort of I understood them.
Oh, thank you. Early in the book, you talk about the process by which President Xi sort of consolidated power for himself and sort of changed the standing and role of the party in society. And an important part of that was the anti-corruption campaign that began really before, under his leadership, even before he was the core leader of the party. Can you give us sort of an update? This was something that just was not a one-shot deal. It seemed to sort of keep building. So can you give us an update on where the anti-corruption campaign stands, but also just be curious to know what you see in terms of how successful it has been in changing the reputation improving the reputation of the party within China and actually changing the way things happen.
Sure. So, first, I think it's important to recognize that anti-corruption campaigns were really a staple of Chinese life, dating back, well, first of all, centuries, but really, Mao Zedong, launched the first anti-corruption campaign practically, 2 years into his tenure in the early 1950s. But most often you'd have an anti-corruption campaign that would sort of, peak within a year and then die down. And then you'd go many years without another one, and then they'd sort of pop up again. I think what's distinguished Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign has been just how consistent it's been, how robust it has been. He hasn't pulled back, so every year, at least up until 2019, more officials were arrested than the year before. So at this point in time, the number of officials that have been detained, arrested, and some have been prosecuted, some have not, now total 3 million. So that's 3 million members out of 90 million Communist Party members. So it is not an inconsequential number. In terms of the sort of how the anti-corruption campaign is prosecuted, the challenge is that he doesn't rely, there's no free media, there's not an independent judiciary, you're not undertaking, he doesn't welcome a participation from the broader populace. That was something that actually a lot of people were interested in the early stages of the Xi era was, could the people become more involved in the anti-corruption campaign, right? Exposing the people that they knew were corrupt. But Xi Jinping didn't actually have any interest in that. So it's a very much a top-down anti-corruption campaign. So it's, his inner circle and the Central Disciplinary Commission. These are the people that decide, whom, right, to go after. And so there was a great study that was done early on in the campaign by a professor who's now at Harvard that looked at sort of the senior most officials at the level of vice minister and above, and found that 40% of those officials that were being arrested for corruption were somehow tied into opponents of Xi Jinping. Somehow they had connections to leading political figures who had competed in some way with Xi Jinping. So there was clearly a political element to it, but also corruption was very real. And Xi Jinping himself took it very seriously. It was really the one issue, as I was doing the research for the book, that I discovered that Xi Jinping had cared about for pretty much his whole career. He believed that Chinese officials should not use their positions for personal economic gain, and that is something that he talked about as he moved up through the party ranks. Not really a big economic reformer, not a leader in some other significant way, but this, I think, is actually fairly core to his belief system. But it doesn't mean that he doesn't use it for his own personal political gain. And people have now pointed out that virtually nobody who's close to Xi Jinping has ever been arrested for corruption. So, anyway, so that's kind of the nature of the campaign. In terms of an update, I haven't actually seen the numbers from 2020. I don't know how the pandemic, for example, affected the campaign. But what has shifted a little bit is they expanded the campaign to include non-party members, so officials who are not members of the Communist Party, and especially leading officials. So you might have the head of a hospital who is not a Communist Party member. So important to understand in China's system that the Communist Party officials hold 60% of all sort of significant civil service positions, right? So we're talking roughly about the other 40% of government officials that could be affected by this. And so I don't know what's happened, in the past year or so. My guess is that there was a little bit of a drop off, but I don't know. So has it been successful, to the last part of your question? That depends on how you measure success. And you could say 3 million people out of 90 million, there's something there, right? That's an accomplishment in and of itself, removing, those 3 million people from their positions, or at least, exploring whether they were corrupt or not. I think the ways in which it hasn't been successful is that, he's still arresting more officials every year than he did the year before. So what that suggests to me, one of two things happening. Sometimes these officials are being arrested for crimes they committed years ago, right? And again, there can be other motives in terms of going after a person. So you can, anybody in China can probably almost be found to be corrupt, any official, because that's how you did business, right? But so it just depends on who the government wants to go after. So one could say that the fact that there are still so many people being arrested, suggests that actually they haven't addressed the core of the problem. And I guess the other point I'd make is that he has promoted people into very senior positions who have then been arrested for corruption. So for example, China had, for the first time, the president of Interpol in 2016 was a Chinese official who'd been a senior official in the public security apparatus, right? Xi Jinping promoted him into the position, and within 2 years, he was arrested, detained back in China, forced to come home, and sentenced to jail for I forget how many years now. The head of China's sort of cyber commission, Lu Wei, also promoted by Xi Jinping, later arrested for corruption. So I guess I would say that I think it's definitely had an impact. I think that many people in China are very supportive of the campaign, especially at the local level. But I don't think that it has addressed the root causes of it. I don't think that it has had the transformational effect on people's behavior that Xi Jinping would have desired. We're now, more than 8 years into his tenure.
Thank you. You mentioned that when Xi Jinping became president, he did not have a reputation or really a background in economic reform. But then we get to this third plenum in November of 2013, and there was this big announcement that economic reform and markets were going to start ruling everything. I mean, there was what seemed to be very promising, and as you sort of pointed out in the book, there were Western scholars at the time who said, well, this proves that Xi is more in the tradition of Deng Xiaoping than of Mao or of other people. But then you go on in the rest of that particular chapter to talk about sort of the difficulties of bringing about market reform in China, the history, the prehistory of all of this, going back to before 1949, and the roadblocks that have come in the way of market reform. So I guess my question is, how would you describe? I teach comparative economic systems classes. If you say, how, to a person who has no idea about China at all, and if they just say, what is the nature of the economic system in China today? How would you describe that? And do you think it's sort of moving in a more market direction, or is it moving in a direction of being more centrally controlled?
I mean, it's a this is not going to be a good word. It's like, it's a mixed economy, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's still half baked in terms of the reform process and its move toward the market. I think, as you were saying, that people thought that Xi Jinping was going to be a big market reformer. The third plenum marked sort of an inflection point where economic reforms were again going to move forward, because they really had stagnated during the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao era. And being in New York City, I can tell you that the financial community all was very excited about the third plenum, and they were convinced that Xi Jinping was a big economic reformer. And in fact, China brought a lot of them. It's very interesting. Brought a number of very prominent, media personalities, as well as a number of very senior financial officials not financial officials, business people, bankers, and others from New York City to Beijing, where they kind of got treated to this special seminar around the unveiling of the third plenum. And they all came back and they were all excited. And I said, well, did you actually read the document? Because, in the third plenum, it does say that the market will be a decisive force. It also says that the state will retain a commanding role in the economy. So if you just wait a couple pages, you're going to see that actually there's a little bit of continuation of the state's role. And in fact, what we've seen is that, Xi Jinping is someone, both in the political realm and in the economic realm, who likes to maintain control. And I think it's very difficult for him to sort of take his fingers off the levers of control. And he has put the party back into, the economy, strengthened the role of the party, certainly within state-owned enterprises and even in private enterprises. I mean, one of the things I talk about, is the fact that they have party officials now in the private enterprises who are supposed to be responsible for making decisions about investments when they have no business doing that. But just because they're party officials, Xi Jinping wants to ensure that private enterprise aligns its work, its efforts, its decisions with the interests of the party. And certainly you can see that now, I think, with the crackdown on the in the financial sector on companies like Alibaba, et cetera. A lot of these companies pay, a very steep price. They're flying high, and now they're being reined in by the party. So, my sense for where the economy is going, basically Xi Jinping has announced a big new sort of theory, dual circulation. He announced it last August. It's coming, it was again promoted this past March at the two sessions, which is the gathering of the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. Basically, the idea is that China is its own mini global economy, that it can innovate, manufacture, and produce, as much as possible, right? Xi Jinping wants to expand the degree to which China is basically self-sufficient. At the same time, still he wants to engage with the global economy. It's not about becoming autarkic. Their exports, he wants to ensure that China, has access to the technology and know-how that it needs. And, he made a very interesting statement that he wants to make sure that China is still part of the global supply chains because, there was a big move beginning in the Trump administration, of course, and not only in the US, but other countries, to encourage companies to move away from China, right? To reshore, to pull parts of their supply chains out of China, in part for security reasons, in part for economic reasons. And so Xi Jinping wants to make sure that the Chinese economy remains open to foreign investment because he doesn't, want these firms to leave. He believes that having those companies in China is not only important for the Chinese economy, making it more competitive, but it's important as a deterrent in the sort of more political and strategic realm, because he knows that those business people will go, to their governments and lobby on behalf of China. So I think, Xi Jinping is always sort of fiddling with the degree to which China opens and closes its economy. You can never be sure, what you're going to get. I'll make one last point on this, because I know I'm going on long, but I think it's just to your point, I think it's a useful example. One of the big shifts that we've seen in the past probably 6 to 9 months has been opening in the financial services sector. And so a lot of excitement. JP Morgan, other banks have gone in, now all of a sudden in the past month or so, we've had a whole new set of regulations about how much, capital these banks can bring in and a bunch of other things. And so, there's a huge opening, right? And everybody thinks, wow, this is great. Everything's all set. And then all of a sudden they start to eat away at it until the point that you begin to wonder, like, how much is this really going to work in the end? So again, I think, there's just this opening and closing, and it's just a constant process.
Yeah, we're already getting some good questions in the Q&A box, and I encourage all of you to keep those questions coming. Actually, there are two from Ashwin Jayakumar that I think connect to things you just talked about. One of them, you mentioned that Xi Jinping is somebody who doesn't like to give up control. Well, so obviously one question is, how long after the constitutional changes that he pushed through, how long do you think he will choose to stay in his current position? But Ashwin also asked this question, which seems to connect with what you were just saying about financial services. What's your take on the Jack Ma and Alibaba situation currently unfolding? Will this affect investment within the country in terms of FDI? So
okay, so I'll try to be brief so we can have as many questions as possible. In terms of how long Xi Jinping is going to stay, yes, he amended the constitution so that he can hold the presidency as for forever. So now he can hold the three most important positions: General Secretary of the Communist Party, Chairman of the Central Military Commission, and President of the country for life. I imagine that 2035 is probably a safe bet for when he would retreat from all of those positions, for sure. I think he might retire out earlier than that, but he will just step back to the second line. I think in any case, no matter which one or whether all of the positions he gives up, he will hold the title of chairman so that he can continue to pull the strings in terms of, sort of overall broad policy and strategy. It's clear he has not identified a successor, anyone that he trusts to realize his vision, because he has a vision for where he wants to see the country go in 2035 and 2049. And I think he wants to be in power as long as possible to realize that vision. In terms of Jack Ma and Alibaba and what this all means, I think the Jack Ma story is a couple different stories wrapped into one. And, it's a story of real concern by the Chinese government around fintech and Chinese government's ability to control the financial services sector, and in particular Ant and sort of the lending and sort of reining all of that in. It's also a story of Jack Ma flying a little too high to, close to the sun. And it's because it's not only about the punishment now is not only in terms of transforming Ant from a fintech company into a bank, which lowers its valuation, which means it has to have a lot more, capital and reserves, basically takes all the fun out of it for Jack Ma, let's put it that way. But they're also, just basically putting the kibosh on the university, his very special university that he was running, kind of a business school, elite, very elite business school. And so this is a much bigger attack on him. And the fact that we've only seen him appear once really in public since November, is very telling. What does it mean in terms of FDI? So far, it hasn't seemed to scare off foreign direct investment. Last year, China surpassed the United States as the largest recipient of FDI in the world. And so, there's just a lot of enthusiasm in the international community. Everyone believes they can make money in China now that China's opened up its bond market, and you've got a lot of, again, more access for financial services. I think you're going to see a lot of money continue to flow in. So I think it raises alarm bells, but it's not enough to deter people from investing. That would be my take.
Okay. By the way, I don't want to get nerdy about this because hopefully we can have a conversation some other time. But when you said that you think that the position that she would hold on to as chairman, once upon a time, Deng Xiaoping never was chairman. He held on to the military commission, and so it seems like there are various options here. But I'd like to talk a little bit about technology and see how that sort of fits to what we're doing in the U.S. right now. Obviously, an important part of the competition between the U.S. and China, and the intelligence community just came out with this new assessment. It was just released today, but it was dated a few days ago, saying that China is now our major competitor in the world. And let's see, I'm trying to remember the phraseology it used to talk about that. But clearly, China's been doing very well in some technologies, and 5G and advances in artificial intelligence has some advantages in those areas, just given the ability to collect data and work with sort of the oil of artificial intelligence. So I wonder, right now, we have the debate going on in the United States about the infrastructure bill. And that includes, I think, $180 billion for R&D expenditures in the U.S., another $100 billion for broadband. In your Senate testimony, you talked about the fact that China on these technological issues has taken a strategic approach, looking at the long term, that the U.S. needs to be more strategic in its decision making. Do you see what's going on with things like the infrastructure bill as helpful in that direction?
No, I do. I mean, in many respects, in some areas we're playing catch up. I mean, one of the things that we see China now doing is, moving ahead very aggressively with a new digital currency electronic payment system. Mm-hmm. And we're still trying to figure out what we want to do in that space. And they've got 4 pilot projects underway. They're going to roll it out at the Olympics. And so to some extent, the infrastructure bill is just about saying, yikes, we have not been paying attention, and we've got to catch up. But I do think, sometimes we sort of diminish our own capabilities, our own successes. And I think part of that reason for that is that, when you have a status quo power and you have a rising power, right? Every advantage, every, improvement that the rising power makes looks like a loss somehow for the status quo power. And so I think the media often tend to hype all of China's achievements. And so it's important. That's a great picture. Yeah, it's important to keep things in perspective as well. And so yes, China has made advances in AI, but people would still say that the U.S. is the leading power when it comes to artificial intelligence. That we have 60% of the top researchers in AI in the world. I think China and the UK each have like 10%. Of course, about half of those researchers that we have are from China, which reminds us the importance of keeping our doors open and immigration and all those things. And I think that in some respects, that is also part of the infrastructure of the United States, right? It's the hard infrastructure, of course, but it's also the soft infrastructure. And it's about our values of openness and transparency. And so I think that's also what the Biden administration is going to bring to this process. So I think they're headed in the right direction. I think the R&D spending is essential. And if you look, I think something like 50% of the sort of top 100, breakthrough technologies in the United States throughout history were the result of public-private partnerships. That might even be a higher percentage than that. So I think that tells us that these things can work, right? Having the government engaged it can be extremely important. And so the private sector can't do it all. And especially when you're competing with China, a country that, provides enormous subsidies to its companies. And we're talking not just central government subsidies, but, local governments are supporting, their own champions. I think, we have to change the way that we do business. We have to adapt, right? We have to be cognizant of the strategy of the other team, right? I mean, it's like, Baylor can go out on the basketball, court and play its game, but it should adjust to the way the other team is playing as well. And I think that's also, what we have to do with regard to China. I have to say I'm fairly optimistic, frankly. I think, we are innately an innovative country. And when it comes to breakthrough technology, we are the best for true innovation. Look at our vaccines, right? I guarantee you, here's a good example, because I guarantee you that if China had Pfizer and Moderna, the US media and media everywhere would be full of the fact that they had the two most efficacious vaccines in the world, right? This would be seen as yet another example of the triumph of China. But because it's the United States, because people expect that from the United States, it doesn't get that same kind of media attention and hype. So that's just a good, maybe a way of showing, sort of explicating what I meant when I said, when we frame it that way, it's easy for us to lose.
Since you mentioned the vaccines, I had this sort of a little later in my outline, but I'll go on and say and ask this. If we 10 years from now, when we look back at the coronavirus pandemic, and we say, obviously, the pandemic has significances of all kinds, but part of it that we're talking about here has to do with the sort of relative reputations of these two competing powers, the U.S. and China. And so when we're looking back at this 10 years from now, in the sort of the view of these two countries from the world, on the one side, we have these questions about the actual origins of the virus, but less question about the fact that China was a bit slow, this innate secrecy and kind of getting the word out and allowing even a domestic response to occur as soon as it should have occurred in China. But on the other hand, positively, China, through very strong actions, has been able to sort of mitigate the effects internally, and where we've sort of been the other way around. We've done just a horrible job of mitigating the disease, but as you mentioned, we've played an important role in developing those vaccines, and now we have one of the most successful rollouts of the vaccine in the world. And so there are these different things going on. And of course, what we don't know is whether we'll ever get a clear answer to the question of where how the virus kind of got out in the public in the first place. We may or may not ever know that. But what's your guess as to when we look back at this 10 years from now, sort of a post-mortem of this whole thing, what will we think of the impact of this pandemic?
So, I mean, I would say that the story isn't fully told, I think, as you alluded to. And so I don't know that we can look back and have the complete picture yet. And we don't even know what form the pandemic might continue, might spike. Things can still change. So, but that being said, I think, from Chinese perspective, this is they are triumphal. They are triumphant. And so this is, Xi Jinping talks about this as, the East is rising, the West is declining. This is a strategic opportunity. It's a little bit like what happened during the global financial crisis, where China looked and said, we always knew we were going to surpass the United States. It's just happening a lot faster than we thought. And they were surprised when the US bounced back, after the financial crisis. And hopefully, I think for all our sakes, they'll be surprised again when we bounce back after this. Look, there's no doubt that the United States has taken a very significant hit to its international standing and prestige as a result of our chaotic and truly terrible handling of this pandemic. There's just, and people can blame China, for covering it up at the outset, and they deserve to be held accountable. They have yet to admit any culpability. They don't say they've done anything wrong. They were transparent. They did everything, not just for China, but for the entire world, So that is not okay. But, in the end, we lost, 500,000 people. And there is no, there's no justification for that. And nothing more that can be said as far as I'm concerned. So, in the true, I think most important meaning, when we look back at this, I think, our best hope is to say that this was really an important wake-up call, for us as a country. And frankly, everything else that attended that whole period, the racism and the, Kung flu and China virus, all of that, I think is just a terrible stain on the United States. And so, we have work to do to make up for that. Now I will say that, from the perspective of the rest of the world looking at China, what did turn out to be quite interesting was that China had an amazing story to tell. As you say, within 2 months, they basically, brought this virus under control. They were able to become largest provider of PPE, personal protective equipment. They are an enormous provider right now of vaccines. So they have mask diplomacy, they have vaccine diplomacy. Their economy grew by 2.3%. Ours contracted. Everybody, all the major economies contracted except for China. So they have a great story to tell. But because they behaved in such a bullying and ugly fashion, right? The whole wolf warrior diplomacy, the coercion, the boycott of Australian goods because Australia dared to ask for an investigation into the origins of the coronavirus. When you look at public opinion polls that have been taken globally, right? Southeast Asia, Europe, North America, globally, Xi Jinping and China, plummeted. Their reputation plummeted between 2019 and 2020 because people were so appalled, I think, frankly, by how China behaved, right, as it was, again, leading in the global response. But between that and Hong Kong and Xinjiang, all of these things sort of combined, I think, really to undermine what otherwise should have been a real sort of diplomatic triumph for China.
Before we get too far away from the topic of technology, we're getting a lot of really good questions. I think we could probably go on for about 4 hours if you're ready for that, but I don't think we will. Howard Townsend asked, is China still in the habit of stealing technology from the U.S. and other Western companies? And, or I guess we could broaden that question and just say, on this broader question of intellectual property rights, what should the U.S. be doing for protection of intellectual property rights in our interactions with China?
Yeah. So I would say that if you look at reports from the U.S.-China Chamber of Commerce and the European Union and China Chamber of Commerce, you'll see that over the past few years, companies generally report an improvement in China's protection of intellectual property. So overall, I would say the trend line is improving. Having said that, companies here in the United States report, 10,000 attacks, cyber attacks, right? And it's not just for, the technology that someone has to make a particular machine tool, right? Or an algorithm or something, but it can be intellectual property around a deal, right? So attacks on law firms and investment banks about, their deal-making strategies or their offers. I have to say, I don't have what I would call a really good comprehensive picture of sort of intellectual property protection, because I think the nature of what's going on has changed. But for companies that are doing business inside China, I think they overall have found that there's better intellectual property rights protection now than a decade ago. And this was also actually one of the elements of President Trump's trade deal with China, was an assurance that China would improve its intellectual property rights protection. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but not really.
Well, and that's very similar to the story I've been hearing from business people that I know that are working in China. But there's also seems to be on this topic and several other topics that you address in the book and elsewhere, to some extent, a disconnect between de jure and de facto. I mean, the Chinese laws for protection of intellectual property are quite good, but then there's the question of the way those are administered, and in China, if you want to administer something strictly, you can do that. But earlier I mentioned, and you were concerned that you wrote your dissertation in 1994. I wrote mine in 1978, and so you're a youngster as far as I'm concerned. But again, that dissertation was about the question of climate change, and in the book, The Third Revolution, there's a chapter sort of on the topic of the environment and China's addressing of its environmental problems, which I've been to China, I think it's 12 times. And I've said that if I were a Chinese economist, I think I would be an environmental economist, because if you can't breathe, nothing else seems to matter a lot, and so, but you talk in the book about, your phrase was the undeniable progress that China has made in a number of areas. We know about their development of solar panels and of moving quickly into electric cars. There are those sorts of things. But on the other side, you still have coal-powered plants being built. And in the book, you talk about this kind of geographic inequality, that there's been sort of protection of the eastern and coastal areas, while rapid development in the West means that the environment continues to slide there. So there's been sort of a zero-sum game within China. Now, coming out of all that, we have these recent announcements from President Xi that the country is going to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. What is your take on that pledge?
Yeah. So I'm very fond of pointing out that it's pretty much the one pledge that Xi Jinping has made, because he loves to set targets and timetables where he is most certainly not going to be around to see whether it happens or not. But I would say this: I think 2060 is in his mind a long time away, and I think one of the things that people look, they have made progress, as I said, and they've put in place, a trading system, emissions trading system for the power sector. They've opened up this whole green bond market. There's a lot going on. Xi Jinping has said they're going to have 25% of their primary energy come from renewables by 2030. So they have some targets in place. There are many problems with, each one of those initiatives in terms of how real they are and how much they're going to accomplish, how robust, for example, the emissions trading system is, and the answer is not very. I think the real issue is that, coal continues to expand, and CO2 emissions have continued to increase every year since the US, under President Trump, pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. Once the US was out, China seemed to feel no real restraint or restrictions. What's so interesting is that American emissions actually fell for several of those years. So it's pretty funny. We pull out of Paris and our emissions decrease. They stay in and get all the love from the international community, and their emissions continue to increase. I mean, technically speaking, they're allowed to have their emissions increase until 2030. That's when their emissions are supposed to peak. The real issue, I would say, are sort of twofold. One, China continues to export coal-fired power plants globally through its Belt and Road Initiative, as well as other heavy, polluting industries. Two, and now I just forgot what my second point was going to be. But I guess the point is that they, that people were expecting from the two sessions that I mentioned earlier, that people were expecting China to come out with some more ambitious targets. So there's actually a lot of discussion among climate experts in China, a lot of disappointment because they believe that the government actually is not on a path to realize that carbon neutrality goal by 2060. They don't see the evidence that China's taking the steps now over the next 5 years, right? Because at the 2 sessions, they also presented the next 5-year plan, that it hasn't put in the policies that are going to allow it to achieve that 2060 carbon neutrality goal. So that kind of raises some questions and some doubts in people's minds about the direction in which China is moving. I would say only that we have to wait to see. I'm going to give them the rest of this year because, as you probably know, former Senator Kerry is going to China to have a climate meeting with Xi Jinping, who's sort of their top climate person. And we have the Glasgow summit coming in the fall. So it's possible that China was holding some of its fire to see, maybe it can make some other announcements, alongside the United States around climate change. That's one possibility. That would be the optimistic scenario. So we'll hold our breath for that and see what happens.
You mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, and in the Q&A, we've gotten quite a few questions related one way or another to that, and several of those are related to China's role in Africa. And obviously, China sees China, which in some ways, the way it's been up to this point, at least, it's sort of like a big factory that just needs lots and lots of raw materials. And so BRI in Africa partly seems to be designed to bring in the resources that are needed in China. But what do you see as China's sort of agenda in Africa, and what all is it trying to accomplish there?
So, China actually has a very long history in Africa, dating back to the 50s and the 60s. It's been very deeply engaged there. So it's considered kind of a long-term, partner for many African countries. It has an organization that, is at China plus all the countries of Africa. They meet every year. Xi Jinping typically has gone to an African country at the outset of every year, sort of his first big visit. I don't know whether that's true this year, but in any case, it is beyond the Belt and Road, that China-African relationship. I think what's interesting is Belt and Road, you're absolutely right that China has long looked at Africa for its natural resources, and a lot of the types of infrastructure that it did throughout the 90s and 2000s before Belt and Road, a lot of that had to do with being able to get those resources out to China. So you had in mind, you actually needed to build the road and help the port in order to get the commodities out back to China. So, but now this is about connectivity, and a lot of it has to do with exporting Chinese overcapacity because China's built up so much itself. It has a lot of companies that build dams and bridges and railroads, et cetera. So a lot of it has to do with that. It's also, I think, strategic, right? China's put in its first military logistics base in Djibouti. So as People's Liberation Army has grown in strength and expanded its mandate, to basically protect the Chinese people and Chinese commerce globally, I think we're going to see more of these, logistics bases pop up. And then there's a political component to this as well. Oh, you have the digital Silk Road, absolutely important. And I think this is going to be, along with the Health Silk Road, because both of these things actually involve more private companies than state-owned companies as well. I think these are going to be the two big pushes for China moving forward. And this is, it's satellite systems, it's fiber optic cables, it's e-commerce. It's going to be this digital currency that I mentioned earlier. I think China sees a lot of opportunities here. In Kenya, there's a Star Times has a project where they're basically bringing television to, 10,000 homes or 10,000 villages, sorry. And they're providing the content. So it's not just the actual infrastructure part, but again, they're bringing in, politics into it and providing the content. So the cheapest available sort of package for these people is one that has TV from Kenya and TV from China. If you want the BBC or Al Jazeera, else you have to pay more. So very clever, really. They're training officials in places like Tanzania on how to control the internet and manage civil society. So the Belt and Road in Africa is a big enterprise. So it's not really just about accessing resources anymore. It's really in some ways transforming the landscape in ways that ensure that Africa will align more closely with Beijing.
Mm-hmm. We're down to just our last few minutes, and there are a few other questions I want to be sure to get in. One of them, this year, we're marking the 50th anniversary of ping pong diplomacy back in 1971, but also this year, it's this next year, we have the Beijing Winter Olympics coming up. And so usually sports has been this kind of hallowed ground that we say that ping pong is what helped to normalize relations. We try to leave politics on the side, but of course, it's difficult to do that these days. And so a number of people early on called for a boycott of the Beijing Olympics. The Biden administration said they're not really considering that, but Mitt Romney and others have said, well, okay, let's send a team and let's send television over there, but nobody else should go. Do you see sports as kind of a politics free zone, or what do you think about the Olympics?
No, I don't think sports has ever been politics free, actually, and certainly not this Olympics with what's going on in Xinjiang, which has been termed genocide by the Trump administration, by the Biden administration, and by other countries as well. And I think it bears pointing out that this issue of Xinjiang is not simply one that the United States is concerned about, and the upwards of 1 million Uyghur Muslims who are in labor and re-education camps in Xinjiang. But this is something that the European Union and the UK and Canada, along with the United States, all these countries, targeted sanctions against, levied sanctions against a number of companies and also officials in Xinjiang who are deemed to be responsible for this. So, I like Mitt Romney's proposals. Basically, he had an opinion piece and talked really about, send the TV, but we're not going to televise the opening ceremony, the closing ceremony. Mm-hmm. Let the athletes, go, let them play, compete. But we don't want to give anything else to China in the process. Other people say we should move the Olympics. I think it's still open for debate. And again, other countries are having very serious debates on this exact same topic. So I would guess this is something that the Biden administration is going to talk, with our allies and our partners and come up with, hopefully, sort of, coherent approach, that brings us all together.
Another huge issue, maybe huger than the one we just talked about. It's expected that tomorrow President Biden will announce that the U.S. is going to fully withdraw from Afghanistan by 9/11 of this year, which is a little later than Trump had talked about, but still getting out quickly. And a lot of people are looking at that as part of a pivot, less attention on the Middle East, more on other places, and particularly East Asia. And this comes at a time when you have military maneuvers around Taiwan. Chinese both air and sea assets on both the west and east sides of Taiwan, which those locations have significance in themselves. So in the threat assessment that came out, that was made public today, and other places, there are a number of military personnel saying they will not be surprised if we have an actual engagement of some sort. Others are saying that's overblown. What do you think about the possibility of an actual military engagement of some sort around Taiwan in the next months or years?
So quickly, because I am cognizant of the fact that we're supposed to end on time, I would say I think it's unlikely that we'll have a military engagement that would sort of blow up into something significant before the Olympics, because if China actually took some kind of action against Taiwan, that really would blow up their Olympics. I mean, nobody would go, right? So I think they know that. So I'm not, but I agree with people like Admiral Davidson, former head of Indo-PACOM, who said, you know, next 2 to 6 years, entirely possible that China will take action. I think Xi Jinping is very concerned about the direction in which Taiwan is moving. You know, like 2% of the people favor reunification with the mainland. I think he's concerned that the international community is rallying around Taiwan, that Taiwan is being drawn into partnerships and other things that's going to make it very difficult for China at some point in the future to gain control over Taiwan. And so I think all of those things may impel him to act sooner than later.
Well, there's a lot more I'd love to talk about, but the time has come. So, Liz Brailsford, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Steve. And thanks to both of you. What an excellent discussion. I love, we didn't get to talk about it too long, but I love what ping pong diplomacy opened up for us. It was a whole new world after that. And Liz, I don't think you could be long-winded. You are a wealth of information. So thank you for your expertise, and you two are great conversation partners. And if you're not a member of the council, please join us. We would love to have you. I want to see you more. I want to meet you in person. We are slowly moving in that direction. Please stay tuned to our newsletters for more news on that. We are thinking that depending on the current status at that time, but we're thinking that late fall may be the time when we start to delve back into that. In any case, thanks for joining us. Again, thank you to Baylor University and Steve, you especially, for your support in this. It is the last session of our Global Business Forum series. We will be back. Thank you again. Have a great evening.